percentage-wise?
We're at about 70% based on the most recent data that we have.
Okay, so that's lofty. And so how much have you spent on this program?
Chairman, I would go back to the answer I provided before, which is two things. One, I talked about how we've tracked the budget historically at the mobile source, and the other categories that are in the budget and the legislative appropriation. And the point that I made was beginning this fiscal year, we broke it down at a program level, and we will share how we're breaking it down. We don't have that report. I need a full fiscal year under me. But if I look back, we have tracked at the appropriation level, year on year, how many dollars were spent, and we can tell that. Yeah. But what you're really asking is, hey, at this individual program, tell me. And what I'm saying, I can't answer that with clarity today, but going forward, the level of disaggregation we'll be able to.
Okay. And that being said, I would think that that's my hope, that you track everything line item going forward so that we can actually understand if it is a necessity based on value. Number two, I think that over a period of time, if you could give us, you're saying you've reduced by 70% on the particulates, correct? And not on the whole gamut of what could be accomplished through the heavy vehicle program, just on particulate per diesel. So what I'm asking, if the goal was 85% of particulates, or that was the goal, what were the other goals of that program?
Let me try to fill in on that. On the oxides of nitrogen side, the ozone precursors that the heavy-duty program is the backbone of what we're doing to achieve the health-based standards in the South Coast and the San Joaquin Valley. There are two programs in the heavy-duty sector that are particularly important for achieving the health-based standards in those two regions. One are the truck and bus regulation to accelerate turnover. The other is the federal standards for the federal tailpipe standards for the emissions of a new truck. Those two together have us about halfway to our goal, starting at a starting point in about 2010, about halfway to our goal that we need to be in 2023.
So I appreciate that. And we keep going to the federal standard component going forward. So just say, for instance, that we were diligent about working towards our goals, but we weren't able to accomplish them by that determinate date. What happens? My understanding is that the goal and the date gets extended because we've been diligent?
That's an excellent question. Under the Federal Clean Air Act, when you get to your attainment deadline and you fail to meet that, if the levels of pollution that you measure in the air still are above the standard, as Mr. Corey was describing earlier, the US EPA is required to make a finding of failure to attainment, and that starts a new planning process by which you go through, you develop a new state implementation plan, you look at all your emission sources, you look at the fine data that we have embedded within our inventory to determine where are there areas where you fell short in terms of achieving the emission reductions that you expected? What are the reasons you fell short? Was there more growth in the sector than you had anticipated when you developed the plan, or were the emission controls less effective, or in use did they deteriorate more? You examine that fine level of detail that we have embedded in the inventory, and you produce a new plan. There are some federal penalties that fall if you fail to attain, and those can come in the form of fees that the regions have to pay. In fact, both the South Coast and the San Joaquin Valley are subject to those fees right now, based on the attainment of the 1 hour ozone standard. The good news there is the San Joaquin Valley, we are submitting to US EPA, you may have already signed it, Richard, a finding of that they in fact have met the 1 hour standard now in the San Joaquin Valley, based on the truck and bus and other rules, and that would lift the imposition, potentially lift the imposition of those fees.
Fantastic. It's good news. So I think on that note, what I'm looking at also is when we look at these things, and you mentioned San Joaquin and other constrained or areas that have difficulty achieving attainment, that we as legislators might need to acknowledge that and be able to pool resources for those areas that maybe are on high attainment or very close to it, and then we help you say, well, no, let's reallocate over to here because they're struggling. And be able to make sure that those folks have every tool in the toolbox that they need. And that's information we need to know to be able to partner so that we can help you with that. I mean, I was in the Central Valley watching the farmers having to water their roads because of the particulates, and that's a huge cost to those. And and the inability to use recycled water because of there's not a potable usage for the USDA down there that they'll accept. So there's a lot of things that we need to know about because of how the dynamic works on their non-attainment. So giving us more information, you can't give us too much information is what I'm saying. So, but we'll move on to transport refrigeration units. And would you please explain this program to us, please?
Okay, so this is a program that requires, these are transport refrigeration units, I think folks probably know. These are the units that you see attached to trailers, so tractor trailers, and they keep the contents of the tractor trailer refrigerated, either frozen or refrigerated. By and large, they use diesel engines, and as Dr. Ayala mentioned, as part of the diesel risk reduction plan, we identified needing to reduce emissions from diesel engines. Basically, what this rule requires is that engines need to be either replaced with new engines, they need to be repowered with newer engines, or they need to have a particulate filter installed on them. So the rule originally had estimated that it was going to get a 70% reduction in particulate matter and a 30% reduction in NOx. We are still in the process of implementing this rule. I was trying to look to see if I could figure out sort of what percentage along we are. This is actually one of the categories where we found that it was a little bit more difficult to implement the rule than we thought when we actually adopted the regulation. And we did have to go back to the board to make adjustments to the regulation because some of the things that we thought were going to happen in terms of technology that would be available didn't come to pass. And so we provided some flexibility to the industry in terms of how they can comply with that rule. Because of that, it's going to take a little bit longer to get to the final final goals that we set.
Thank you. So, based on the refrigeration on the trailers, do you have a count on how many of those have to be replaced through that tier when you say that they come to a point where they're obsolete and then they need to go? And do you have a price per unit what that costs for those refrigeration units going forward? How much that costs the industry each trailer?
I don't have those costs with me here, but we can provide them to you. We have staff that work very closely both with the industry and with the manufacturers of the units in order to, cost is one of the things obviously that we're tracking both, as Mr. Corey mentioned, when we're developing the regulation, when we're looking at not just the cost effectiveness, but also the cost to the industry. And it's also one of the factors that we are looking at as we evaluate how the regulation is being implemented. So we're in constant communication with both folks that are trying to comply with the regulation as well as the manufacturers, so we can get you that information.
I appreciate that. And, I think what I'm looking at also is if you look at, trying to keep one size fits all out of the equation. If you had a 65-year-old trucker who's in his last years of his work life, and he came up on that ability to have to replace his refrigeration unit on his trailer, and say he only had 2 years left that he wanted to work or could work, and so are we diminishing that individual's ability to continue working that 2 years by this regulation, number one, and what would we gain by making that person not be able to recoup the return on their investment going forward? Just saying, that factor. Do we ever look at that? but there's not a one-size-fits-all for every individual on that trailer for those units?
Well, I think that this is true really we have a series of rules that we call in-use rules. So traditionally, the Air Resources Board did new engine standards, and we said when you're buying a new engine, this engine's going to be cleaner. So starting in 2010 or 2014, there's going to be a clean engine. When you buy your new equipment, it will have this clean engine in it. When we did the diesel risk reduction plan, one of the things that we found when we identified diesel as a toxic air contaminant is that the level of risk was so high and diesel engines are so long-lived that in order to wait for that turnover, and I think you are probably all familiar with the stories about 40, 50, 60, 70-year-old diesel engines that are still out there operating. Diesel engines are great. They're incredibly rugged and durable. Yeah. But what we did in the in-use rules is we said we can't afford to wait. The risk is too high. We have this very aggressive 75% reduction by 2020. And so we're going to put rules in place so that people who own diesel engines, we want to make sure that they're actually turning them over. And that's really part of what's happening in this rule. And I think that as we've implemented those rules at the Air Resources Board, we have faced those challenges, is how do you balance the needs of different fleets and the individual circumstances. We've tried to write rules that have flexibility, and as I mentioned, there's different options for complying with this regulation, whether it's buying a new engine, retrofitting an engine, or putting in not a new engine but a cleaner engine. So we have tried to provide those opportunities.
So is there any ARB incentive programs that helps folks attain that, like we do the EVs, or does the cost ultimately trickle down to the consumer for this attainment?
Right. So it depends on the individual program. For the incentive programs, what we have to provide in order to provide the incentive is either early emission reductions or extra emission reductions. So you either need to go beyond what the regulation requires you to do. So, if you had like a plug-in TRU or an electric TRU, or you need to comply with the regulatory requirement early. And so one of the challenges with these rules is that as those regulatory deadlines come up, folks have fewer and fewer opportunities to receive funds. I will, however, say that the Carl Moyer program, Prop 1B, these are programs that have provided significant investment in cleaner diesel technology. There hasn't been, I think, much use on the TRU side. Partly it's because this is one of the earlier regulations that we adopted, and so the compliance deadlines came up fairly quickly.
So you do have an ability to measure performance on that also?
For the TRUs, I was looking to see what I have here. What we do in terms of checking performance is our enforcement division, when they go and enforce our truck regulations, they also look to see are people complying with the TRU regulation. So we have an active enforcement program. We understand what's out there. People are also, I think, required to report to us in terms of what they have. One of the challenges that we have for off-road engines is, unlike on-road vehicles, which are registered with DMV, so we kind of have an idea of what the population is. One of the big challenges on the off-road side is frequently we don't even know how many engines there are, or what they're doing, or what the horsepowers are, or how old they are. So one of the very, very first things that we do is, we have numbers in the inventory that are estimates. When we start a rulemaking, the first thing we do is a survey, and we try to figure out what is the population of engines. So let me understand how many are really, really old, how many are sort of old, how quickly do they turn over, and that's work that we do in coordination with the industry and frequently also in coordination with academic institutions.
I appreciate that. And so, one of the things that I would look for is that if you are having an upgrade, and did you say it's every 4 years for the refrigeration?
What we're looking at, it's sort of a 7-year program. Okay. So if your engine is 7 years old, then you need to do something with it. Okay, either the filter or replacement. So based on the investment by the private sector, ultimately the consumer who is going to pay for the attainment of that, what would have been the normal service life, and is that individual able to recoup their investment, being able to pass on the cost to the consumer,
or is he or she taking a loss because of what we're doing going forward? In other words, is it a value?
Right. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we look at when we do the economic analysis of the regulation. What we found is that, as you would imagine, there's a pretty good spread, right? So there are some people who, as a business practice, they turn over more frequently, and then there are folks that, as a business practice, they tend to hold engines for longer. And so one of the challenges for us is figuring out what is an appropriate useful life and when do people get that return on investment.
Right. And I could just imagine some big outfit that has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of trailers, what that would be as an expense going forward. I mean, if you so being able to phase something in like that, or be able to understand that maybe it's 8 years. I don't know. But have you guys quantified that 7 years is the economic balance for the industry, plus the ability to capture what the goal is going forward?
Honestly, I'd have to go back and look at the original staff report to see how we dealt with that.
I just look forward to seeing that.
Right.
Just for FY. Senator Bill, you have any questions? Okay, Senator Roth.
Just one or two on this heavy-duty truck regulation issue. I understand I assume there's an economic analysis that happens when a regulation is adopted. But once you have an ongoing regulation and a program, how often do you do a formal cost-benefit analysis of the particular program involved? One. Two, is that analysis published anywhere?
Let me do that.
So let's take the truck and bus as good an example as any. Since adoption, the rule has been formally amended a couple of times. So those are the perfect opportunities for taking a second look at the economics and some of the progress that the technology is making. But I mean, broadly speaking and historically, I think one of the things that we're most proud of in terms of the policies that the board puts in place is I don't think it's ever the case where we adopt a policy and we forget about it. Because for one thing, the regulated community will never let us forget about it. And the second thing is there's always constant and tracking. And I think if you think of the analogy of the iceberg, putting in place the policy and adopting the regulations or the program guidelines, I mean, that's the 10% above the water that you see. Most of the work is implementation, which is below the water, you don't see. And that has to do with, again, continuing to work with industry, making sure that we're making progress. In terms of tracking progress, we have direct and indirect measures, right? Direct is, as we mentioned, a certification program. We constantly and regularly work with industry to make sure that they are certifying the technology that we need, making sure that the technology is progressing as we assume when the rule was first adopted. And then we also have the indirect measures, which is our enforcement activities, where we are out in the field checking, making sure that things are working and the assumptions that we made are holding up. But there's never the case where we just adopt a rule and never go back to it. And there's a number of reasons why we would want to go back and take a second look. But the short answer is absolutely. We're always going back and looking at the assumptions.
Well, a hearing on an amendment to a regulation is a little different than a formal cost-benefit analysis and a published report with regard to that analysis. So I gather the answer to the question is no. You do not do on a regular basis a formal cost-benefit analysis of these programs, other than as the issue may come up in the context of an amendment to the rule raised by industry.
Yeah, no, I think to clarify, perhaps I oversimplify, but any process that takes a rule back to the board will involve the full-blown analysis of not only the economics, but a second look at the technology assumptions. We go back and take a look at the inventory. We use the most recent, best available scientifically defensible data. So it's the full-blown process.
So in the absence of a process where an amendment is taken to the board, in the absence of that, I gather there is no formal cost-benefit analysis of any particular program, and certainly not a top-to-bottom review of your programs on an annual basis or a biannual basis or a 5-year basis?
The way, and I think this really is what you're getting at, Senator, major programs, we periodically report to the board. In fact, some of the most significant programs, an annual report to the board. What's happening? What are we seeing? How is it unfolding? And as part of that, the board's hearing, as they should and as we do, from the regulated community. And if the characterization is that, hey, wait a minute, the cost of that particular technology, I'm just using this as an example, is significantly greater than what staff assumed in the staff report. You know, it's not unfolding as quickly as we had anticipated, or the costs are not going down. We're obligated that, one, they're going to inform the board anyway, so are we. And depending on the specifics, it may trigger an adjustment, a review of that regulation. So, you know, Dr. Al is talking about a formal revisit of amendments. And there's a lot of reasons why we'd want to amend a regulation. But in addition to that, there are ongoing informal reports to the board and to others, basically based on not just our assessment that Dr. Al talked about in terms of enforcement and measurements we're doing, but it's the regulated parties' assessment of the effectiveness of a regulation and the rollout and how, you know, what's working and what isn't. That is part of the process.
Well, have there been instances where, as part of this cost-benefit analysis that you indicate that you do, that you have found one of these line item programs to be ineffective on the basis of that cost-benefit analysis and have eliminated it?
A few things. One, in Dr. Alley will have more details on this, but truck and bus, we talked a little bit about the economy, the economic downturn. That did basically get us to take a second look at that regulation. And we made some adjustments in terms of how it was implemented, in terms of we extended the implementation timetable. We also realized that particularly smaller fleets, I'm not dismissing large fleets and some of the costs, but they were particularly hard hit by that regulation. And it was basically economics that got us to take a look at making some adjustments to the regulation in terms of additional provisions in terms of small fleets, as well as additional focus in terms of incentive dollars. And that was all about experience on the ground and how basically it was unfolding and the distinction between the largest fleets and the small fleets.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. So we're not going to get to all these programs. So, but today, we're not going to today. But I'd like a little high-level discussion about the Port and Vessels Regulations Program. Pursuant to Governor's executive order / the effectiveness of the program, how you've measured the performance, what you expected, what you've gained, or where you're at, and how much it cost. Are you seeing a pattern here? That's what I'm looking for in every program going forward. And I would think that you have heard this, not only from the Senate budget hearing last week, but we want to have more information. We want to be able to discern if you're being effective in certain programs. That's our oversight. You have been legislatively created to adhere to AB 32. We are the legislature. Okay? So that's what we're looking for. Nothing more, nothing less. Okay? It's been 10 years. So if you can give me a high level, because we're time constrained, of the Port and Vessel Regulation Program, I'd really appreciate it.
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about ports and vessels. And again, I think that the regulations, most of these regulations are really related to toxic air contaminants and not really AB 32. So most of these measures were an outgrowth of the identification of diesel particulate as an air toxic in, I think, around the year 2000. And we developed a plan, and we've talked a little bit about the 75% or the 85% reduction goal. So most of these regulations were adopted, you know, in the 2004, 2005, 2006 timeframe. They are mostly fully implemented. And so I'm sort of, kind of broad brush as we go through. If you look at the ocean-going vessels at berth regulation, this is a regulation that requires that when ships come into port, they plug in or they have some other method of reducing their emissions, so they're not just running their marine engines. When we did health risk assessments of areas around the ports, what we found that the largest sources of risk for those communities around the ports were ocean-going vessels, what we called the hoteling emissions, or the emissions from the ships when they're in port, the cargo handling equipment, and then the harbor craft. So harbor craft are things like tugs and fishing vessels and ferries and excursion boats and things like that. So this series of regulations were designed to address those risks. The shore power regulation is currently in the process of being implemented. When it's fully implemented, we're expecting about an 80% reduction of PM and NOx. What that means is that you'll be plugged in 80% of the time when you come in. Right now, we're at about 50%. And it continues to implement from now until 2020. We are in the process right now of looking at potential regulatory changes to this as we've been implementing it and working with both. This was actually a really complicated regulation because it involved the shipping lines, the operators at the ports themselves, utilities to run power. So it was a very complicated regulation to implement. What we found is that there are some things were more complicated. It was a little more difficult sometimes to plug in than we thought. It might take a little longer than we think it is, than we thought it was. So we're in the process of looking at how we might modify that regulation to address some of those issues. But we've also seen new technologies come in. And so now we've seen technologies, we call them colloquially, we call them sort of bonnet technologies. So they sit on top of the smokestack and take up the smoke instead of plugging in the ship. And that has the potential to maybe we can apply the technology to a larger swath of vessels. So, so the goal is 80%. We're at about 50% right now. The ocean-going fuels regulation is a requirement that within 24 nautical miles of the California shore that ships use a lower sulfur distillate fuel. So this is different than the really heavy marine fuel that they were typically using. This regulation is fully implemented. It's an 80% particulate matter reduction and a 50% NOx reduction. So really important both for risk around the ports and meeting our ozone SIP obligations. There are now international standards that apply. There's an international emission control area up and down the West Coast. There's also an ECO, they call them ECAs, that's in Europe. And this regulation, from our perspective, was a real success story because what it showed is that you could switch fuels within some distance of populated areas, and so vessels did have that potential because they have different fuel tanks on board. And so it really sort of pioneered the way to show the International Maritime Organization that this was a viable control strategy. We are continuing to implement our regulation because the regulation that the ECA is not being enforced in quite the same way that we would do it. We actually go to the port when the ships come in and we take fuel samples, and so we actually test the fuel to see if they are complying. Compliance rates are very, very high, and we're very, very pleased with that. The next regulation is the onboard incineration, ATCM. This was actually adopted as a result of legislation. So there were two pieces of legislation that were adopted, and it forbids incineration on cruise ships and other vessels within 3 nautical miles. This is something that our enforcement division also checks on, the compliance with the regulation when they go on and look at the fuels also. So again, we think it's very high rates of compliance and it's fully implemented. The commercial harbor craft regulation is the one I mentioned that applies to things like tugs and fishing vessels and things like that. There's sort of 2 requirements in this regulation. One is if you're buying a new engine, that engine has to be that has to be a current engine in the year that you purchase it. So if you're going to buy a new engine, we want you to buy the cleanest possible engine that you can buy. The second requirement applies to a subset of the commercial harbor craft. And it applies to what we found to be sort of the larger businesses, so the tugboats and work vessels and ferries and things like that. It actually is an in-use regulation. And so it says, we're going to make you turn over your engine. We're going to make you put in a cleaner engine even though you're not planning to purchase one. So of the engines that are subject to the in-use piece of that, about half of them, just under half of them, have complied with the regulation. The final requirement is in about 2022, so we're about halfway there. I think we're about where we thought we would be. And then on the engines that are, there's a notation in the table about $100 million in upgrades for 1,300 marine engines. This is actually incentive money. It's $100 million in incentive money that was used to upgrade marine engines. These are generally things like fishing vessels. Fishing vessels are smaller businesses that aren't subject to the in-use requirement. They're just required to put in a cleaner engine.
So based on that investment, do you have a measurement that you can actually say that this reduced?
Absolutely. I actually don't have it with me, but we absolutely do.
Okay, that's the whole crux to
Yeah.
this whole thing, is when we look at the metrics. Any program that you've described, one of the things I'm afraid of is that we did have private industry spend all that money for plug-in, and then now we have another technology that might be a lot cheaper, and we've already made these industries make this investment. And then others have the opportunity to come in for less. One of the things, the factors also I'd like to look at is that are we becoming less competitive with other ports with the advent of the Panama Canal being widened now and accessibility to other ports that aren't as restrictive with the regulatory issues that we're talking about. So that is one of the things that we need to look at, because my understanding is that there's going to be 3 times, maybe 4 times more of the amount of freight in the next 3 to 5 years coming through our ports if it becomes an incentive or an economic value to the shippers. But I want that to be known that if we're creating a disincentive and we're promoting somebody else's economy because of regulation, what do we need to do together to make it a viable economy so that we achieve our goals,
Right.
but also understand that we're the 7th largest economy in the world right now. I don't want to become the 14th.
I think we are all on the same page on this. I think that, I know that the Air Resources Board recognizes the important role that freight plays in the economy of the state of California, and particularly in the Southern California region. I think that, one of the challenges, as I mentioned, is when we did these health risk assessments, or in the early 2000s, what we found is that the levels of emissions and the risk faced by communities near the ports was way too high. It was unacceptably high, and we had to do something about it. And this was also a time where the economy was really booming, and it was, again, a time where people were thinking, port traffic was going to double or triple, and there was a lot of interest in trying to, we, from a public health standpoint, we need to make sure not only are we not exacerbating the problem for the communities that are by the ports, but we're actually improving the air quality.
That's exactly why we need to know if they're working.
And I think that really, that's really kind of the focus behind the sustainable freight strategy, is bringing together, the air quality regulator, which is us, and we've got these longstanding concerns, which we've talked about here already, bringing together the mobility folks from Caltrans and bringing together the interest of, the state of California in terms of developing the economic engine that is freight in GoBiz. And so bringing together these organizations and looking at a plan, I think we recognize that we're not going to be able to solve the problem at ports simply by using sort of this air quality lens, that we need to be collaborating with the Transportation Agency and the Economic Development Agency in California to get that win-win-win solution that I think we all are really looking for.
And absolutely applaud that outlook. What I'm looking at also as the chairman of the Transportation Committee in the Assembly is there an investment that can be made outside that gate of that port that reduces congestion, so those particulates are dramatically reduced?
Absolutely.
We have throughput for mobility for freight that is absolutely essential for our economy, and that we look at that maybe that short-term goal is a bigger gain by looking at that congestion factor now.